The Hartwell estate still stands in the gray fog of New England, its stone walls covered in ivy like veins choking a corpse. They say the house breathes at night, that its windows glow faintly, though no one lives there, and that if you press your ear against the cold wood of its door frame, you can hear women weeping deep inside the walls. 5 brides were carried through those doors between 1911 and 1919, 5 young women in white, each one celebrated, each one vanished into silence. Their names have been nearly erased from public memory, their graves left unmarked, their voices stolen by a family that cared more for appearances than for truth. You were never meant to hear this story. It was buried with the last shovel of dirt thrown over the 5th bride's coffin when the Hartwells declared the matter closed and the town agreed never to speak of it again. But silence rots, and secrets ferment in the soil until they force their way back to the surface. Tonight, I'm dragging those secrets into the light. The Hartwells were not just wealthy, they were untouchable. Old New England stock, their money traced back to maritime trade, to whaling ships that vanished in the fog with holds full of oil, and to investments in the railroads that cut the Northeast into veins of steel. To live as a Hartwell was to be cloaked in privilege, to be shielded from scandal, to believe that the rules binding other men did not apply to you. But to marry into the Hartwells? That was something else entirely. It was a contract, a transaction of blood, wealth, and obedience, and for 5 women it was a slow death sentence disguised as a wedding vow. What the public saw were candle-lit ceremonies in a Gothic church, veils flowing like smoke, newspaper columns praising the elegance of the brides. What they did not see were the locked doors, the muffled cries at night, the family doctor who visited far too often, or the sealed room in the Hartwell basement where not even the servants dared linger. By the time the 5th bride was lowered into the ground, the town whispered openly of a curse, yet no one asked questions aloud because in 1910's New England, money bought silence, and silence kept men safe. You're about to hear the truth that was buried with those women, but once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a celebration. In 1911, the eldest Hartwell son, Jonathan, took his bride, a pale, delicate schoolteacher named Margaret Hollings, into the estate. She was seen in photographs smiling, clutching a bouquet of lilies, the lace of her dress glistening in the camera's flash powder. Within months, she was gone. The obituary was vague. Complications from fever. The coffin was closed, her body shown to no one, but whispers spread quickly in the nearby village. Margaret had been seen less than a week earlier, walking the orchard with a strange, vacant look in her eyes, guided by Jonathan's hand, as though she were not his wife but his patient. Some swore she stumbled, her ankles bruised, her lips discolored, as if she had been fed something she did not wish to take. No one dared accuse the Hartwells of cruelty, but everyone remembered how quickly her grave was dug, how fast the grass grew over it, how Jonathan never spoke her name again. By the following year, another wedding bell rang through the church, another young woman lured into the family, another fleeting smile frozen in the local paper. Her name was Clara Davenport, a merchant's daughter chosen more for her father's financial connections than for any affection Jonathan might have had for her. Clara lasted barely a year, her obituary nearly identical to Margaret's, her coffin likewise sealed. Complications, they said. Always complications, never clarity. And yet the Hartwells insisted that life in the estate carried on, the family hosting dinners, playing the role of respectable gentry while the townsfolk counted coffins. Behind the stone facade of their mansion, the truth was gnawing its way out like rats in the walls. By the time the 3rd bride, Eleanor Price, was buried in 1915, villagers whispered of something darker than sickness, of an old sickness in the Hartwell bloodline, perhaps, or of rituals whispered in candlelit rooms to preserve the family's strength. Some spoke of a locked chamber in the basement that no servant was ever allowed to enter, a chamber where Eleanor's voice had been heard crying in the night, long after her funeral. And still, the Hartwells carried on with unflinching arrogance. 5 brides in less than a decade, each buried, each sealed, each silenced. To the public, it was a family plagued by cruel fate. But if you look closely, if you strip away the polite obituaries and the silken veils, what you find is not tragedy. You find design. You find a pattern carved in stone and blood, a pattern that was never meant to be uncovered. By the time the 4th bride entered the Hartwell estate in 1917, the town no longer celebrated. They only watched in silence, as if waiting for another funeral bell to toll. Her name was Lillian Moore, the daughter of a local judge, a young woman known for her wit and boldness, the kind of presence that filled a room. People whispered that if anyone could stand against the Hartwell shadow, it would be her. And yet within 9 months, she too was gone, her obituary repeating the same refrain of illness with no further explanation. But this time, something different surfaced. A maid who had served in the household vanished from town only weeks after Lillian's death, leaving behind a half-written letter discovered years later. In it, she described strange powders mixed into tea, injections given in the late hours, and a room in the cellar where Mr. Hartwell said the family's legacy was preserved. Her words were never delivered, her name never spoken again, but the fragment was enough to fuel generations of suspicion. When the 5th bride came in 1919, Mary Whitfield, she was not a stranger brought from outside wealth or political favor. She was a cousin, a blood relative, drawn back into the family to bind its fortune even tighter. Marrying within bloodlines was a Hartwell tradition stretching back to the 18th century, a practice whispered to be the true source of their fortune and their curse. Mary's face never even appeared in the paper. Her marriage was announced quietly, her funeral written in even quieter lines only 11 months later. 5 women in less than 10 years, each promised a future, each reduced to a coffin. By then, the estate had become a place no one wished to approach. The orchards lay untended, the windows dark, the family holding fewer and fewer public dinners. But in the dead of night, villagers reported seeing lanterns moving in the fields, men in dark coats carrying something long and heavy between them, toward the back of the property, always toward the same place, the sealed stone mausoleum where only Hartwells were buried. And it was said that sometimes, if you stood by its gate at midnight, you could hear more than silence. You could hear faint, muffled voices, pleading, crying, as though the dead themselves had never been granted rest. What few dared to admit aloud was that by the time Mary Whitfield's coffin was lowered into the ground, the Hartwell estate was no longer a house. It was a machine, a closed circuit of blood, wealth, and silence, feeding on the lives of the women who entered it. Town records later revealed an unsettling pattern. Each bride's death coincided with major financial gains for the family, inheritances transferred, land deeds absorbed, shares in shipping and textile companies mysteriously signed over into Hartwell control. Marriage was not romance in this dynasty, it was acquisition, and death was the final clause in the contract. And yet, beneath the economic motives, there was something older, something that seeped into every rumor like a poison. Whispers of a family ritual meant to preserve their bloodline against the slow decay that haunted other wealthy families of the age. Servants spoke in hushed tones of basement ceremonies, of chalk markings on the cellar floor that did not resemble anything Christian, of chants spoken in a language none recognized, and always the doctor, Dr. Elias Corbin, a man with degrees from Europe and an unsettling reputation for progressive treatments, was summoned to the estate in the late hours and never seen leaving until dawn. He signed every death certificate, his name written in ink as though it were a seal of authority that no one dared contest. But behind that signature lay something more sinister. He was not just the Hartwells' physician. He was their keeper, their architect of silence, the one who ensured that each bride's suffering was veiled as illness, that each death was explained away as the cruelty of fate, And so the Hartwell estate continued to feed itself, generation after generation, while the village learned the language of complicity. Never ask, never challenge, never speak too loudly. Because those who spoke too loudly oft and disappeared themselves. The woods around the estate were said to be haunted not by ghosts, but by warnings. Hunters who ventured too close returned with missing time, claiming the forest itself shifted to lead them astray. Farmers who trespassed found their livestock mutilated by dawn. It was not just a house, it was a gravity, pulling everything into its orbit, devouring, erasing. And still, 5 graves stood as the only official memory, 5 coffins buried beneath polished marble markers that bore no names, only the Hartwell crest. Identity stripped, silence preserved. It was as if the women had never existed at all, except in the faint cries that some swore still drifted through the orchard wind. By the 1920s, the Hartwell estate had become less a family residence and more a looming fortress of dread, a structure that cast its influence over the town like a shadow no one could step out from. The people of the village no longer referred to the brides by name, but as the 5, a shorthand that carried both pity and warning, a way to acknowledge the tragedy without inviting its curse. Children were told not to play near the iron gates. Women whispered prayers when passing the orchard, and men, especially those who once courted the Hartwell brides, drank themselves into silence rather than speak of what they had lost. And through all of this, Dr. Elias Corbin remained a constant figure, gliding between the estate and the town like a grim sentinel. He was not an old man, but his face bore a strange pallor, as if the color of life had slowly been bled from him. His eyes, it was said, lingered too long when studying the living, as though he measured them not as people, but as subjects for some unseen ledger. Rumors spread that he had trained in places whispered about only in libraries, Vienna, Prague, even Cairo, where medicine blurred into alchemy and science into ritual. The villagers suspected he was less a physician and more a sorcerer, binding the Hartwells to a covenant of blood that required sacrifice. But the truth was even darker. Corbin did not simply treat the brides. He studied them, keeping meticulous notes that some claimed filled whole shelves in the east wing of the estate. He measured their pulses during sleep, drew their blood under the pretense of tonics, and subjected them to experiments in nervous excitation, treatments involving electricity, powders, and injections that left them pale and trembling. And always, after months of this, they sickened, withered, and died, their dowries and inheritances flowing neatly into Hartwell coffers. The village, as fear deepened when a sexton at the churchyard quietly confided that the brides' coffins were unnaturally heavy, and that when one shifted on the ropes before burial, he heard not the hollow rattle of a body, but the dense thud of something else, as though stone or metal lay inside. Yet no one dared lift the lids, for the Hartwells stood watching every interment, their presence cold and suffocating. By then it was no longer a question of whether another bride would die. It was an expectation, a grim rhythm the town had learned to endure. And beneath that rhythm lay a terrible suspicion, that the Hartwells and their doctor were not simply allowing death, but orchestrating it, binding it, using it to fuel something far older than marriage or money. The first murmur of resistance came not from a man, but from an old washerwoman named Clara Wills, who had worked in the Hartwell kitchen since girlhood and had scrubbed the linens of every bride who entered those walls. She was the one who noticed the stains that did not belong to any sickness, thick, dark, copper-smelling blotches that soaked deeper than wine, and strange burns along the fabric's edges as if touched by acid or fire. She told a priest once, whispering through the confessional grate, but the priest's reply was only silence, followed by a warning to leave such matters to God. Yet Clara would not let it rest. On a rain-thick night in 1921, she gathered 2 farmhands and a carpenter, men who had all lost sisters or cousins to the Hartwells' reach, and they crept toward the estate with lanterns dimmed and shovels in hand. Their plan was not to confront, but to uncover, to force open one of the bride's graves and prove what everyone suspected. They reached the mausoleum before midnight, pried at the iron gate, and with every scrape of metal against stone, they felt the weight of centuries pressing back against them. When at last they cracked the seal of one coffin, the carpenter swore he heard something move inside. The lid was lifted only an inch before a rush of air burst forth, thick, foul, and warm, as if exhaled from lungs long after they should have rotted. Clara screamed when she saw the glimpse within, not a decayed corpse, but a body strangely intact, skin stretched tight and waxen, eyes shut but twitching beneath the lids, as though trapped in some endless dream. Before they could pull the lid wider, lantern light flickered across the orchard and dark figures emerged. Hartwell men, and behind them Dr. Corbin himself, his white coat faintly visible in the dark. The intruders fled, dropping their tools, but Clara was caught. She vanished that night, her small cottage cleared out by morning, as if she had never lived there at all. The farmhands and carpenter survived, but they never spoke again, except in broken fragments while drunk, muttering of the living dead and voices under stone. From that night on, the town knew the truth but carried it in silence, because the Hartwells had shown what happened to those who pried. And still, every evening, the lanterns moved in the orchard. Every midnight the wind carried faint cries, and the cellar windows flickered with a sickly glow that no one dared trace back to its source. What the survivors whispered, in slurred confessions and broken mutterings, was more horrifying than any ghost tale the village had ever known, that the brides had not died at all, at least not in the way the town believed. Their bodies were preserved, sustained in some twilight state between life and death, as though Dr. Corbin had discovered a way to anchor the soul while denying it rest. One farmhand described the face he saw in the coffin lid's narrow opening, lips parted as if mid-breath, a tear frozen on the cheek, chest neither rising nor falling, yet refusing to collapse into stillness. It was a body trapped, embalmed by some method not known to medicine, a specimen of agony disguised as a corpse. This rumor, once seeded, spread in whispers through taverns and back alleys until it became a kind of secret scripture. The Hartwell brides were not dead, but bound, their life force siphoned in the cellar beneath the estate. Some said Corbin had learned the technique in Prague, studying among occult circles that treated the body as a vessel of endless experimentation. Others swore it was older, brought across the sea by the first Hartwells in the 1700s, when a cousin had vanished in the Pyrenees and returned with strange books bound in cracked leather and pages written in a language that made the eyes water to look upon. Whatever its origin, the method served a single purpose: preservation. Not for love, nor mourning, but for power. It was believed that the Hartwells used their brides as conduits, vessels through which wealth and fortune were drawn and renewed. A union of blood sealed the contract, and when the bride was sacrificed, her vitality fed the lineage itself, keeping the Hartwell men vigorous, their crops unnaturally lush, their coffers ever filling. And while the town feared this knowledge, none dared act, for everyone remembered what became of Clara Wills. Those who spoke too freely found themselves vanishing in the night, their homes swept clean, their names erased from ledgers as if they had never lived. Yet the orchard remained restless, the cellar windows glowing faintly at hours when no lamp should burn, and the mausoleum, always sealed, always watched, stood as the heart of a mystery no one could solve without forfeiting their own soul. By the mid-1920s, the Hartwell line had grown stranger, darker, and less human in the eyes of the townspeople, as though each new child born under that roof carried not only the blood of the family, but also the weight of the rituals whispered to bind it. The children of the estate were rarely seen in daylight, tutored behind locked gates by foreign governesses, who came and went with alarming frequency, their faces pale, their eyes haunted, as if they too had glimpsed what no outsider should. On the rare occasions the Hartwell boys were spotted, wandering the edge of the orchard or riding in black carriages through town, people noted an unsettling sameness about them: skin too smooth, eyes too deep-set, movements too precise, like marionettes operating under invisible strings. More disturbing still were the whispers about the girls, few in number, always fragile, and never reaching womanhood. A schoolmistress once told in hushed tones of a Hartwell daughter who attended her classroom for a single year. The girl never spoke above a whisper, drew endless sketches of coffins and keys, and fainted whenever the church bells rang, as though the sound rattled something inside her skull. She vanished before the year's end, her absence unacknowledged, her name struck from the school ledger. Townsfolk began to wonder aloud if the Hartwell men even desired children in the natural sense, or if the births were orchestrations, rituals disguised as lineage, each child bred for purpose rather than love. Some claimed the orchard itself bore proof of this corruption: apples that glistened unnaturally red but rotted black from within, blossoms blooming out of season, and crows circling the estate year-round in unbroken patterns. It was said that to eat fruit from the Hartwell trees was to invite sickness, that to drink their well water was to court fever, as though the land itself was steeped in the residue of the family's bargains. Still, the Hartwells flourished, while the village declined, as if their prosperity came at the cost of everyone beyond their gates. And though the townspeople watched with fear, none could bring themselves to confront the truth, that the children themselves seemed marked, vessels of the same dark covenant that had claimed the brides, destined either to inherit the rituals or be consumed by them. By 1927, the silence that had bound the town like chains began to crack, not from within, but from the arrival of outsiders, journalists, genealogists, and a handful of curious men who styled themselves as investigators of the occult. Word of the Hartwell tragedies had drifted beyond county borders, carried in fragments of gossip and hushed tavern tales, until it reached the ears of those hungry for scandal or forbidden knowledge. One such man was Charles Redmond, a writer from Chicago who claimed to be compiling a book on the cursed dynasties of America. He arrived in town armed with notebooks and an unsettling confidence, speaking too openly of the 5 brides, the sealed mausoleum, and the name of Dr. Elias Corbin. Villagers warned him to leave, but Redmond pressed on, even securing an interview with a former Hartwell coachman who confessed, while drunk, that he had once carried crates to the cellar that rattled like bones, though they had come from no grave. Within a week, Redmond was gone. His hotel room lay stripped bare, his papers missing, his typewriter left abandoned in the lobby, as if he had walked out and never returned. 2 months later, a genealogist tracing old marriage bonds between the Hartwells and European cousins vanished in the same way, his last known letter to his wife describing a book bound in hide, locked behind a gate of iron, hidden in the orchard earth. By then, even the authorities, spurred by pressure from outside families, sent a pair of investigators to question the Hartwells. They entered the estate on a Sunday afternoon and were never seen again. Official records state they left town the next morning, but no train conductor remembered selling them tickets, no driver recalled carrying them, and their badges were found decades later buried under loose soil near the mausoleum gate. Each disappearance deepened the sense that the Hartwell estate was more than cursed. It was actively defended, its secrets shielded by forces that could erase men from history itself. The villagers, once tempted to hope outsiders might end the cycle, learned instead that the estate consumed not only its brides, but anyone reckless enough to pierce its veil. And so the silence thickened again, heavier, more desperate, for now it was clear. The Hartwells' power was not local, not confined, but woven into networks that reached beyond the village, ensuring that truth itself could be strangled before it ever breathed. The more the disappearances mounted, the more the town began to center its suspicions not solely on the Hartwell men, but on the figure who hovered in every shadow of their history, Dr. Elias Corbin. He was seen less frequently in daylight now, emerging only in twilight hours to walk the orchard paths or disappear into the mausoleum with keys no one else possessed. Rumors spread that he had not aged a day since his arrival decades earlier, his hair remaining the same iron gray, his posture straight as though untouched by time, while men around him withered into stooped shadows. Old villagers whispered that their fathers had seen him during the first bride's funeral in 1910, looking exactly as he did now in 1927, which suggested something impossible, that Corbin was not bound to the same passage of years as ordinary men. Some claimed he was not a doctor at all, but a keeper of an older covenant, a man, or something wearing the shape of a man, tasked with guarding the Hartwell line. The town began to note the way animals avoided him. Dogs whined and refused to follow when he passed. Horses reared if his shadow touched them, and birds fell silent when he lingered under their trees. Even the earth seemed uneasy beneath him, villagers recalling how grass withered in patches where his boots had stood too long. And though he signed every death certificate, stamped every official record, there was never a body laid bare for examination outside Hartwell walls. The brides were carried to their coffins already sealed, their faces never shown, their deaths certified by a man who appeared to exist outside ordinary law. More unsettling still were the whispers of those who lived closest to the estate, and swore that when Corbin's lamp burned late in the cellar windows, voices could be heard faintly drifting across the fields. Female voices, strained and trembling, not in speech, but in a kin of endless chant, as though reciting words fed to them by force. If this was true, it meant Corbin had not simply preserved the brides but enslaved them, their souls shackled to rituals that bound the Hartwell fortune. And yet, despite these horrors, no one acted, because by then it was no longer certain that Corbin was mortal, nor that confronting him would mean survival. He was no longer seen as a doctor, but as the architect of something eternal, a figure who had been with the family since its rise and who might well remain until its end. By the close of the decade, the mausoleum had become the very heart of the Hartwell terror, a structure that no villager would approach after dusk, for it was said that the dead inside were never truly silent. Built of heavy gray stone, its surface veined with moss like veins on an ancient hand, the mausoleum seemed to breathe in the moonlight, stones shifting subtly, doors groaning as though strained from within. Grave diggers spoke of hearing a steady hum beneath the ground, like the vibration of distant machinery, and children dared one another to press their ears to the iron gate, where they swore they heard whispers too low to be human. Some nights, the air around it was thick with the smell of iron and rot, and on rare occasions faint light leaked through the cracks, pulsing in rhythm like a beating heart. It was no ordinary resting place. It was a chamber of preservation, a laboratory of the damned where Dr. Corbin and the Hartwells conducted their most secret rites. A passing stonemason once remarked that the architecture was wrong, that the stones were cut in ways he had only seen in old-world crypts, where geometry was meant not for beauty but for containment, as if the structure itself was designed to hold something in, not keep the curious out. And indeed, when storms rolled across the valley, lightning seemed drawn to the mausoleum, striking its roof again and again, as though the heavens themselves sought to break it open. Villagers whispered that beneath its floor lay tunnels connected to the Hartwell cellar, passages used to transport the brides' bodies, or what remained of them, after Corbin had finished his work. One drunk farmer swore he saw shadows moving behind its barred windows, long after the last bride had been buried, silhouettes of women pacing, their heads bowed, their hands pressed to the glass before vanishing into nothing. Though the Hartwell insisted it was a sacred family vault, the people of the town knew it was something else entirely, a machine of stone and blood built to imprison the unquiet, a place where the boundary between life and death was not respected but manipulated, twisted and weaponized to preserve the dynasty. And the longer it stood, the more it seemed less a tomb than a warning a monolith radiating the simple truth that the Hartwell's power was not natural, and that their wealth was fed not by labor or luck but by sacrifice buried alive in the earth. It was in the spring of 1931 when the first true attempt to break into the mausoleum took place, an act of desperation born from years of hushed suffering and quiet fear. 3 young men, sons of farmers who had lost land to Hartwell acquisitions, armed themselves with crowbars, hammers, and lanterns, swearing that if they uncovered the truth, they could finally rouse the town to rise against the family. Under a moon veiled in clouds, they pried open the rusted iron gate and forced their way into the mausoleum's narrow corridor. Inside, the air was thick and wet, as if the walls themselves were sweating, and the silence was broken only by the dripping of unseen water. At first they found only coffins, their surfaces engraved with the Hartwell crest, the wood unrotted despite their age. But when one of the men forced open a lid, what lay inside nearly drove them mad. There was no corpse, no decay, but a body perfectly preserved, the skin smooth and pale, the eyelids trembling as though locked in an endless dream. And then it happened. The eyes snapped open. The woman inside, recognized from faded photographs as the second bride, let out a sound not of life, but of something trapped too long, a shriek that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. The men dropped their lanterns, spilling fire that lit the chamber with a flickering, hellish glow, and in that light they saw movement. Other coffins, shaking, lids rattling, muffled cries pressing against the wood. Terrified, they fled, but only 2 made it out. The third, a boy named Henry Vale, was pulled backward into the dark by something unseen, his screams swallowed by the mausoleum as the iron gate slammed shut on its own. The survivors returned to the village pale and raving, their hair streaked with gray, their hands trembling uncontrollably. They spoke of the half-dead, the bound, and swore that Dr. Corbin himself, Apul, paired in the firelight, standing calmly at the far end of the chamber, his eyes glowing like coals, watching them flee without moving a step. Henry was never seen again, and his name was erased from town records within a week, as if he had never existed. From that night forward, no one dared approach the mausoleum, not even in daylight. It had revealed itself not as a vault of the dead, but as a prison of the living, a machine that harvested breath without allowing release, overseen by a doctor who seemed less a man than a sentinel of eternity. After Henry Vale's disappearance, the village was never whole again. His family searched the woods for weeks, their cries echoing through the hills, but no trace of him was ever found. Some whispered that Henry's bloodline had been chosen as payment for trespassing where no man should tread, that the Hartwells and their physician demanded replacements to sustain their covenant. Others believed Henry had been absorbed into the same twilight existence as the brides, neither alive nor dead, his voice now one of the muffled cries in the mausoleum's sealed tombs. What tore at the villagers most was not the fear itself, but the silence imposed upon them. Within days, officials from Hartford arrived, men in black coats who bore no insignia, and asked no questions. They ordered the Vale family to stop searching, issued documents declaring Henry missing by misadventure, and warned the community that any further disturbance of the Hartwell grounds would be considered trespass against the state. The message was clear. Their grief was irrelevant, their loyalty had already been bought. But the villagers knew better. This was not law but manipulation, a control mechanism that preyed on their fear and obedience. Families stopped gathering in the square at night, windows were shuttered early, and church bells grew silent. Even the clergy avoided speaking of death, as though acknowledging the Hartwell brides might summon their watchful spirits. Mothers forbade children from playing near the estate, yet some claimed to see pale figures drifting along the tree line, veiled in white, as if searching for something stolen. The village fractured under the weight of secrets too heavy to hold. Half the people swore silence was survival. The other half burned with a quiet rage, plotting to uncover the truth and dismantle the Hartwell curse. But every attempt was smothered by unseen hands, every voice silenced by fear of vanishing like Henry. And so the Hartwell estate became both a graveyard and a stage, a place where the community's will was broken and reforged into obedience. The mausoleum was not just a tomb. It was a mirror held up to the living, reminding them of their own powerlessness. They had seen the truth once, and it had destroyed them. Now the question was not whether the Hartwells held a secret, but whether the villagers themselves had become part of it, complicit in keeping the darkness fed. By the time the 1940s dawned, most in the village assumed Dr. Corbin had long since perished, his grave unmarked, his role in the Hartwell tragedies reduced to whispers carried by wind through broken shutters. But just as the war in Europe brought fear of unseen enemies, the town itself was reminded that its greatest terror had never left. For in the summer of 1943, a new physician arrived under the name Dr. Elias Gray, claiming to have been assigned to oversee public health in the rural communities of New England. He was tall, gaunt, his skin stretched too tight across his bones, and his eyes, sharp, unblinking, the same shade of cold mercury the elders remembered, made old men tremble and young mothers clutch their children. Though he introduced himself as an outsider, too many recognized him, not by face alone, but by presence, the peculiar stillness that entered a room when he did. Gray, Corbin in another mask, set up a clinic in a converted farmhouse on the outskirts of the village, offering free care to those who could not afford the journey to Hartford. His remedies worked with alarming speed, his surgeries left no scars, and his knowledge of anatomy bordered on the supernatural. But with each healing came a cost no one wished to name. Those who left his care often changed, not sick, not dead, but altered. They would speak less, their eyes losing light, their laughter hollow, as though some spark had been drawn out of them and transferred elsewhere. More disturbing still, the widows of the village began to dream. They described visions of white-veiled figures pressing against glass coffins, their mouths moving soundlessly in pleas for release, while a man in a dark coat took notes by lamplight. When one widow dared describe the man, she said, "He wore the face of Dr. Gray, but his shadow wore the face of Corbin." The clergy attempted to confront him, citing the Hartwell tragedies, but within a month the reverend was found dead at his pulpit, his skin pale, his blood turned thick and black in his veins, and the coroner, handpicked by Gray, declared it natural causes. From then on, the villagers understood. The Hartwell covenant was still active, and Dr. Corbin, under whatever name he chose, was its eternal steward. The man had not died because men like him did not die. They continued wearing masks, feeding on fear, binding generations to rituals of silence. As the war years pressed on, the truth began to seep through the cracks of the village's silence, for the Hartwell covenant was no longer confined to shadowed manors and crumbling churches. It had found its way into the bloodstream of institutions far beyond. Strange men in black coats and government seals began appearing in the countryside, speaking with Dr. Gray in hushed tones, their automobiles idling at night along the dirt roads, their faces lit faintly by the glow of cigarettes. Villagers whispered that the war had given Corbin new purpose, that the same twisted experiments once practiced on the Hartwell brides had been offered to agencies hungry for advantages no conventional science could grant. The widow's dreams grew sharper, filled with visions of ships that sailed without engines, soldiers who marched with blank faces, and women whose wombs carried not children, but something else, something engineered to endure. The villagers noticed that recruitment posters for the war effort bore eerily familiar phrases, promising glory through sacrifice, echoing the very language Corbin had once used to justify the Hartwell tragedies. And then, in 1944, a train passed through the valley in the dead of night, its windows covered, its cargo unknown. But some swore they heard the muffled sound of women weeping inside, the same cadence as the lost brides. When questioned, officials told the villagers it was medical personnel being relocated for safety. Few believed it. The lines between Hartwell's curse and national duty blurred, suggesting that the covenant had been adopted by powers larger than Corbin himself. He was no longer a solitary predator. He was a node in a network, one that drew upon the language of patriotism to cloak the oldest form of bondage, sacrifice of the innocent for the ambitions of the few. The villagers began to understand that what they thought was a yisohai, local haunting, was in truth a testing ground, a blueprint that had been refined and exported, stitched into uniforms, memoranda, and oaths. It was no longer just about the Hartwells or their brides. It was about a machinery of control that fed upon the same silence that had once protected Corbin. The war would end, but the machinery it awakened would never go back to sleep. When the war finally ended and the soldiers returned home, the village expected relief, a release from the shadow that had lingered since the Covenant's birth, but instead the curse spread like smoke carried on their very breath. Veterans who had never set foot near Hartwell began to display signs familiar only to those who had lived under the Covenant's shadow: sleeplessness punctuated by vivid dreams of veiled women whispering promises they could not remember upon waking, sudden fits of paralysis where their bodies turned stiff as though embalmed, and an unshakable sense that their lives were not entirely their own. Some awoke in the middle of the night speaking in voices that were not theirs, reciting fragments of medical oaths, foreign chants, or the names of women no one in their family had ever heard of. Their wives wept quietly in kitchens, saying their husbands returned not as men, but as vessels, carrying something implanted not by bullet or shrapnel, but by intention. And when they gathered at taverns, the stories spread. Soldiers from different divisions, different theaters of war, telling the same dream. A long hall lined with coffins, each with a woman in white pressing her palms against the glass, and a figure with silver eyes moving silently between them, writing on a ledger no one dared read. This could not be coincidence, the villagers reasoned. It was proof that Dr. Corbin, or whatever name he wore in government files, had threaded his covenant into the very machinery of war, embedding it into the psyche of men who fought, ensuring the curse traveled wherever they returned. Some soldiers began to waste away despite clean bills of health, their bodies hollowing, as if something within them had been siphoned. Others grew violent without cause, attacking their families with strength beyond their nature, then collapsing into sobs without memory of what they had done. The villagers, who had once believed Hartwell's evil was chained to their soil, now realized it had been loosed across oceans, brought back not as folklore, but as lived experience, stitched into the minds of thousands. The war had not ended the covenant. It had magnified it, seeded it into every corner of society through the very men meant to defend it. And in quiet houses, behind locked doors, more women began to whisper the same words once spoken by the brides: "We are still chosen. We cannot escape." It was the women who noticed first, as it always had been, the wives who woke to husbands standing rigid at the foot of the bed, staring blankly into the dark, the widows who heard the same names repeated in their dreams, names whispered long before they were born, the mothers who saw their children sketching strange symbols in the margins of school books without ever being taught their meaning. They began to write letters to one another, at first quietly, under the guise of sharing recipes or condolences for war losses, but soon the words between them carried a different weight. In kitchens and sewing circles, they spoke of the covenant not as a myth, but as a living contagion, a presence that had traveled home inside the men they loved. They formed what they called the Vigil, a secret network of women who documented every sign, the nights their husbands spoke with borrowed voices, the mornings when children's eyes gleamed too brightly as though lit from within, the instances when a family member vanished for days, only to return with no memory, smelling faintly of formaldehyde. They compared dreams, and the similarities were undeniable. Always the brides, always the glass coffins, always the figure with silver eyes, keeping ledger of the living and the dead. What terrified them most was not merely the repetition, but the implication that their visions were instructions. Messages meant to remind them of a covenant they had never sworn, but were nonetheless bound to. Some of the women tried to warn the clergy, but the priests were either too frightened to speak or too entangled in the silence that had always served Corbin's purpose. Others turned to doctors, only to find their words dismissed as hysteria or paranoia, as though medical science itself had been instructed to deny what it could not control. And so the women did what institutions could not. They began keeping their own records, hiding journals beneath floorboards, cataloging names, symptoms, and patterns that stretched across states and towns. They suspected the men were not to blame, that they were carriers rather than conspirators, vessels rather than villains, and in this realization, a grim determination took root. If the covenant had been birthed through the suffering of brides, then perhaps it would be women, bound together across generations, who would unravel it. But even as they vowed to resist, they knew the enemy they faced had already learned to move through governments, armies, and churches. They were not fighting a man, they were fighting a machine. The vigil's suspicions were confirmed when scraps of evidence began surfacing in the most unlikely of places: medical textbooks borrowed from universities, journals discarded in hospital basements, and lecture notes smuggled by sympathetic nurses. In these pages, the women recognized diagrams they had seen before, not in any textbook, but in their dreams. The same sketches of glass coffins, the same anatomical charts marked not with Latin names, but with runes they had traced unconsciously in the margins of their own letters. Corbin's hand was there, unmistakable, as if his teachings had been codified and disseminated under sterile academic titles. A nurse in Boston confided that her professor referred to Corbin's principle, though he would never define it directly, only describing it as the reclamation of vitality from vessels deemed redundant. Students spoke the phrase with reverence, never asking its origin, as though repeating a catechism. In New Haven, a young doctor was dismissed after raising questions about unusual procedures being taught in secret seminars, procedures involving transfusions that seemed less about saving lives and more about extracting them. And in Hartford, one of the vigil discovered that the local hospital's archive contained case files dating back to the Hartwell brides, but the names had been redacted, the records preserved as though still instructive, still relevant. The women realized, with dawning horror, that Corbin had no need to live in one body. His doctrine was the vessel now, carried forward by institutions that wore the mask of legitimacy. Medicine itself had become the covenant's newest sanctuary, cloaking sacrificial rituals beneath the language of progress and research. Hospitals that claimed to heal were quietly refining the same art of extraction Corbin had perfected, only now with funding, with authority, with unchallenged power. The vigil understood this was the most dangerous stage yet, because the covenant was no longer hidden in a manor or a clinic on the edge of town. It was embedded in the very places society trusted most. Doctors wore white coats instead of black, but their hands moved with the same precision, their eyes gleamed with the same hunger. What had once been a curse whispered in nightmares was now a curriculum, a doctrine disguised as science, passed from one generation of physicians to the next, ensuring Corbin's legacy would outlive even memory itself. Knowing they could no longer simply observe from the shadows, the vigil took the most dangerous step yet. They began infiltrating the very institutions that carried Corbin's poison forward. Some joined as nurses, others as assistants to physicians, clerks in hospital archives, even cleaning staff who could move unnoticed through wards where experiments were hidden behind locked doors. What they found confirmed every nightmare. Operating theaters used not for saving lives, but for draining them. Wards where patients were recorded as discharged, though their bodies never left the premises. Morgues filled with women whose death certificates bore identical causes. Vague phrases like failure of vitality or cessation of vigor. One member smuggled out a blood-stained ledger that listed patients not by name, but by number, each with notations beside them that read like inventory, as if people were no longer individuals, but resources. Another, stationed in a university hospital, discovered entire lecture halls devoted to Corbin's so-called principle, where students were encouraged to reclaim what nature wastes. But the deeper the vigil pushed, the more dangerous it became. One by one, women vanished. A nurse in Philadelphia, who had reported seeing silver-eyed men in the basement corridors, never came home from her shift. A mother in Connecticut, who had collected journals for the group, was found drowned in her own well, her fingernails torn as if she had been clawing to climb out. Each disappearance was written off by authorities as accident or misadventure, yet the vigil knew better. Corbin's hand was still directing the machinery, pruning away threats with the same clinical precision he had always wielded. Still, the women persisted, driven by a grim loyalty to the brides whose suffering had begun it all. They copied documents by hand late at night, burned duplicates into letters that looked ordinary, and passed them across state lines hidden in baskets of cloth or children's toys. Every risk was worth it, because they believed exposure was the only weapon they had. If the covenant could be dragged into the light, perhaps it would finally lose its power. But Corbin's covenant had always thrived on silence and shadows, and the women were beginning to understand a terrible truth. The institutions they thought they could expose were already too vast, too complicit, too willing to look away, because they too had become dependent on the harvest. It was in 1951, within the marble corridors of a teaching hospital in New York, that one of the vigil finally found the proof they had long dreaded, the undeniable sign that Dr. Corbin himself still walked among them, untouched by time, unchanged in purpose. The woman, a nurse named Margaret Hale, had been assigned to assist in a lecture given to visiting physicians, a closed session reserved only for those deemed worthy of what was called advanced instruction. She slipped in quietly, feigning the role of a servant carrying water, but what she saw froze her blood. At the head of the room stood a man she recognized instantly from the descriptions whispered across decades. The gaunt frame, the silver eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh into marrow, the voice that spoke without tremor, as steady and calm as if it had never aged. He introduced himself not as Corbin, nor as Gray, but as Dr. Caro, a visiting consultant in experimental anatomy. Yet every word he spoke carried the same cadence recorded in old journals, the same phrasing used in the notes the vigil had smuggled from forgotten basements. He moved easily among men young enough to be his grandsons, and not one of them questioned his presence, as though they had been conditioned to accept him without hesitation. Margaret watched as he demonstrated a procedure on a cadaver, his hands precise, his instructions cold, describing not how to heal, but how to reclaim vitality before it disperses. And when he glanced up, his eyes caught hers for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She knew he recognized her not as a nurse, but as a threat, as though the vigil's efforts had been in his ledger all along. Margaret fled that night, carrying her memory like a burning brand, and her account spread through the vigil like wildfire. Corbin was no ghost, no legacy passed from teacher to student. He was still here, walking freely in plain sight, donning new names as effortlessly as coats, embedding himself deeper into the world's most trusted halls. The revelation shattered their last illusions. They were not resisting a doctrine left behind by a dead man. They were resisting the man himself, unchanged across generations, shielded by the institutions he had infected. And if he could endure untouched for decades, perhaps centuries, then the vigil faced a question too terrifying to speak aloud. Was Corbin even human at all? Margaret's revelation struck the vigil like a hammer, splitting their unity as surely as a blade cleaves wood. For years they had believed they were dismantling the residue of a man long dead, chipping away at a doctrine disguised as science. But to learn that Corbin still walked among them, unaged, unchanged, eternal, was a truth too heavy for all to bear. Some clung desperately to the belief that he was still mortal, that however he had extended his life, there must exist a way to undo it. These women spoke of poisons, of fire, of rituals that could sever even the deepest bond, convinced that Corbin's flesh could still be destroyed if only they found the right weapon. Others, however, sank into despair, certain now that he was not a man, but something older, a steward of the covenant, bound by forces beyond human reach. To them, Corbin was not a predator who had learned to cheat time. He was time itself, a custodian of a cycle that had existed long before the Hartwells and would continue long after the vigil was gone. The fracture grew into open conflict. Some argued for direct action, planning to infiltrate another of his lectures and strike him down before witnesses. Others cautioned that to expose themselves was to invite annihilation, that Corbin had survived countless challenges before and had always emerged stronger, feeding on opposition as fuel. Yet amid the arguments, one plan rose above the rest, whispered by Margaret herself. If Corbin's power was bound to secrecy, then perhaps only revelation could wound him. Not by blade or fire, but by dragging his covenant into the light of the public eye, by recording and spreading the truth so widely that no suppression could contain it. This proposal frightened them most of all, for they knew the cost. To confront Corbin openly meant to sacrifice their anonymity, their safety, perhaps even their lives. But for the first time, the vigil was faced with a choice larger than survival. They could either fade quietly into the shadows, allowing the covenant to thrive unchallenged, or risk everything on a single strike that might finally break the cycle. And so they began preparing for their most dangerous mission yet, to expose Dr. Corbin in the very halls he had hidden within, to force the world to look upon the silver-eyed man who had stolen centuries, and to make him answer not just to them, but to history itself. The plan was set with the precision of desperation, for the vigil knew they would have only one chance to strike, and it would not be with weapons, but with revelation. In 1953, Corbin, under the name Dr. Caro, was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at a prestigious medical symposium in Boston, an event attended by the brightest physicians, government officials, and journalists hungry for stories of progress. The vigil saw it as the perfect stage. If they could expose him here, before eyes that could not be so easily silenced, his mask might finally shatter. They prepared carefully, smuggling documents into the city, ledgers of the Hartwell brides, sketches of the glass coffins, testimonies written in the trembling hands of widows and soldiers still haunted by dreams. Margaret herself planned to stand and name him, not just as Dr. Caro, but as Corbin, the eternal surgeon who had turned medicine into ritual slaughter. But when the night arrived, the women knew instantly something was wrong. The hall was too heavily guarded, the ushers too watchful, their eyes glazed as though under a spell. Corbin stood at the podium in his black suit, the silver of his eyes gleaming beneath the lights, and as he began to speak, the air itself seemed to thicken. His voice rolled over the crowd like a tide, calm yet commanding, and every head in the audience bent toward him, every ear straining as if enthralled. The vigil members exchanged desperate glances. This was no ordinary lecture. It was a demonstration of power, a mass binding. When Margaret finally rose, her voice cracking as she cried out his true name, half the audience turned not on Corbin, but on her. Their faces were slack, their movements puppet-like, and they dragged her down before she could reach the stage. The documents were seized, the testimonies scattered across the floor, and Corbin never once faltered. He merely smiled, thin and cold, and continued his lecture as though nothing had occurred. To the newspapers the next day, the disruption was described as the act of a hysterical woman overcome by the pressures of modern medicine. Not a single mention of the name Corbin appeared in print. The vigil had not unmasked him. They had revealed themselves, and he had been waiting all along. From that moment forward, their mission was no longer about exposure. It was about survival, for Corbin had marked them, and they knew he would hunt them down one by one as easily as a surgeon removes diseased tissue from the body. Shattered by the failure in Boston and hunted by forces they could barely comprehend, the Vigil went underground, abandoning homes, families, and names, dispersing across the country like fugitives in their own land. They understood now that Corbin could not be confronted directly. His power was too entrenched, his influence too pervasive, his reach stretching into the very institutions meant to record truth and safeguard justice. To fight him meant becoming shadows themselves, moving in silence, hiding in plain sight, and most of all, preserving their knowledge so it could not be erased with their bodies. They devised methods of transmission as ingenious as they were desperate. Some disguised their records as recipe books with ingredients that were not ingredients at all but codes for names, dates, and procedures. Others stitched secrets into quilts, patterns that, to the unknowing eye, appeared harmless, but to the initiated, mapped the spread of the covenant across hospitals, universities, and government offices. Letters were written in invisible ink, tucked inside hymnals, mailed under false identities, each one a fragment of testimony that might outlast the woman who wrote it. Margaret herself began compiling what she called the Bride's Chronicle, a document that blended fact and dream, witness and vision, because she believed the covenant itself operated on the blurred border between the two. They shared a single conviction, that even if Corbin hunted them to extinction, their work would survive, passed into the hands of daughters, granddaughters, or even strangers who would one day stumble upon the patterns and recognize them for what they were. Yet even in hiding, the noose tightened. Women disappeared without trace, their coded recipes or stitched quilts found burned or torn, as if Corbin's eyes were everywhere, unblinking. Some of the Vigil despaired, one despairing. If secrecy was simply another form of silence, the very condition that had allowed Corbin to thrive for centuries. But Margaret held them steady with a single promise. If we cannot destroy him, then we will outlast him. Our words will live where we do not. The covenant feeds on silence. We will leave behind echoes too loud to bury. And so, the Vigil faded from public view, not gone, but burrowed into the marrow of history itself, leaving behind scattered fragments of resistance that would one day be mistaken for folklore, women's gossip, or superstition. In truth, it was their greatest weapon, the knowledge that Corbin could not kill what he could not find all at once. Corbin's retaliation came swiftly and with a cruelty that revealed just how deeply he understood the machinery of the world around him. He did not simply kill the women of the Vigil. Death alone was too merciful, too clean. Instead, he orchestrated their erasure, ensuring that whatever they left behind would be smeared, twisted, and dismissed before it could root in the minds of others. Newspapers across the Northeast began carrying stories of hysterical wives, institutionalized for delusions, their journals of coded recipes and stitched quilts held up as proof of madness rather than testimony. Doctors, many of whom had sat under Corbin's instruction, diagnosed the women with domestic paranoia, war widow's psychosis, or female dementia, neat little terms that stripped their words of credibility. Those who resisted were sometimes found dead in ways so grotesque they became cautionary tales. One woman discovered with her mouth sewn shut, another with her hands removed, as though punished for speaking and writing. Police reports treated these horrors as accidents, or worse, as self-inflicted acts of lunacy. Neighbors, frightened into complicity, whispered that the women had brought it upon themselves by meddling with things best left alone. Corbin, of course, never appeared in any of these accounts, but his shadow was always there, the silver-eyed physician who signed off on death certificates, the lecturer whose words were quoted in medical journals, the consultant who advised courts on the fragile state of women's minds. Each move tightened the noose, reinforcing the narrative that any voice raised against him was diseased, unworthy of belief. And yet, for all his precision, Corbin could not entirely silence the Vigil. Fragments still slipped through. A half-burned letter salvaged from a fireplace, a child's lullaby that contained lines older than its singer, a forgotten quilt tucked into a trunk with patterns no one could quite explain. These remnants whispered their own defiance, carrying the weight of women who had chosen to resist even as the world branded them insane. Still, the lesson was clear. Corbin no longer needed to hide behind locked doors or basements. He had learned to wield society itself as his weapon, turning institutions into walls, turning credibility into chains, and ensuring that truth would rot beneath the label of madness before it ever threatened his covenant. By the 1960s, the Hartwell estate had long been stripped of its grandeur, its halls gutted, its windows shattered, its foundations left to the slow creep of ivy and moss. Yet something about its silence pulled in the curious, especially the young who mistook the ruin for nothing more than a haunted relic. It was in the summer of 1963 that a group of college students from Boston, researching early American textile patterns for an art history project, stumbled into the remains of the East Wing. Beneath layers of dirt and collapsed plaster, they uncovered a trunk filled with quilts, each stitched with bizarre symbols that bore no resemblance to decorative tradition. These weren't flowers or stars or geometric shapes meant for comfort. They were maps, diagrams, formulas, a language that had slept in cloth for nearly half a century. Alongside the quilts were brittle scraps of parchment that seemed to be fragments of the vigil's hidden journals, burned and incomplete, but unmistakably laced with warnings. The students, thinking they had found material for a clever thesis, took the quilts and notes back to their campus, where professors marveled at their intricacy but could not decipher the patterns. Some dismissed them as nonsense, while others argued they must be connected to early colonial witchcraft or secret societies. Yet one professor, a historian named Dr. Malcolm Green, recognized something more sinister. In one journal fragment, he saw the name Corbin etched faintly in the margin, alongside phrases like the marrow oath and his silver eyes. Green, who had studied medical archives, remembered the Hartwell case and the rumors of the doctor who had vanished after the fifth bride's burial. He urged the students to destroy what they had found, insisting that some histories were meant to stay buried, but they laughed at his warnings, thinking them little more than academic theatrics. Within weeks, strange events began circling their lives. One student went missing during a late-night walk. Her body never recovered. Another was institutionalized after scrawling the quilt patterns across every wall of his dorm room, muttering that the seams don't hold anymore. And Green himself was found dead in his study, eyes open, throat cut with surgical precision. The official story painted these as coincidences, tragedies unlinked by anything but timing, yet those who had handled the quilts swore that after Green's death, the fabric seemed to pulse faintly under lamplight, as if something woven into its threads had awakened. The vigil's remnants, once thought to be whispers of forgotten women, had become conduits again, and whether by chance or design, they had summoned back the attention of Corbin, who had been waiting, watching, patient as stone. By the late 1970s, the Hartwell estate was no longer merely a ruin left to curious trespassers. It had been quietly seized under the guise of historical preservation, though no tours were ever offered, no plaques erected, and no restoration attempted. Instead, unmarked vans came and went under the cover of night, their headlights extinguished before reaching the overgrown gates. Inside, what remained of the Hartwell house was gutted further, its stone walls fitted with steel reinforcements, its cellars expanded into corridors humming with generators. It wasn't preservation, it was conversion. Government agencies, working under names that shifted too often to trace, had discovered the quilts and journals in university archives after Green's death, and the symbols that once baffled art historians now drew the interest of military psychologists. The patterns weren't dismissed as madness anymore. They were seen as instructions. Researchers believed the vigil had encoded methods of breaking and remaking human identity, ways of stitching belief and obedience into the very fabric of thought. In those dim chambers beneath Hartwell, subjects were exposed to sequences derived from the quilts, flashing lights, sound cadences, and geometric overlays designed to dismantle the conscious mind. Testimony from a whistleblower decades later claimed the experiments produced terrifying results. Ordinary men reduced to blank obedience within days, women speaking in languages they had never learned, children weeping as though they recognized the patterns instinctively, as if the symbols had always lived in their blood. The estate became a crucible where ancient corruption merged with modern science, where the whispers of the vigil were no longer treated as superstition but as data, stripped of reverence and weaponized. Corbin's shadow was everywhere in the project, his name never spoken but his methods replicated. The erasure of will, the reconfiguration of memory, the branding of resistance as madness. Files labeled participants as brides regardless of sex or age, an echo of the original Hartwell ritual that no bureaucrat could plausibly explain, suggesting that those directing the program knew more than they admitted. Rumors swirled among locals about screams carried across the hills on windless nights, about lights flickering inside windows long since boarded. Yet every attempt to investigate was smothered by official denials, and those who pressed too far found themselves transferred, blacklisted, or silenced outright. What had begun as a family curse in 1910 had metastasized into an institutional engine by 1980, and the Hartwell name was no longer just a ghost story, it was a classified project number. It was in the mid-1980s, as Cold War paranoia pushed governments into ever darker experiments, that cracks in the Hartwell project began to appear, not in the walls of the estate, which had been fortified into an underground maze, but in the minds of those subjected to its rituals reborn as science. Survivors, if one can call them that, began to slip fragments of their torment into the world in ways officials could not anticipate. A woman released after years of confinement claimed she had been part of a bride ceremony, though no record of marriage existed, and her wrists bore faint, burned imprints shaped like rings of interlocking thread. Another man, who vanished from his family for nearly a decade before resurfacing in a psychiatric ward states away, spent his waking hours drawing the same spiraling patterns found in the Hartwell quilts, insisting they weren't drawings, but locks, keeping the real self buried inside. What made these testimonies harder to suppress was their eerie consistency. Though the subjects never met, their stories carried the same language, the same references to brides, vows, veils, and a presence in the room described only as the groom, always faceless yet inescapably powerful. One account, smuggled out in the form of poetry published under a pseudonym, spoke of voices chanting, "As above, so within," a perversion of the old Hermetic maxim that suggested the Hartwell rituals were never destroyed, only translated into new terms by government psychologists. Each survivor left behind more than words. Their bodies seemed to remember what their tongues could not. Scars in precise geometric lines, teeth marks in their own flesh forming crescents that mirrored symbols in Green's recovered notes, and in one case a young boy whose growth halted for nearly 4 years, his body trapped in the form of an 8-year-old while his mind aged onward, a living echo of the unnatural stillness of the Hartwell brides themselves. Officials dismissed each case as coincidence, as unrelated tragedies sewn together by conspiracy theorists, but in private, documents surfaced decades later showing that higher authorities feared the survivors most of all, because if they remembered fully, if they untangled the stitching that bound their silence, they could reveal not only the government's role in perpetuating the vigil's design, but also the deeper, older truth, that what Corbin Hartwell began was not invention, not delusion, but the continuation of a thread that had existed long before him, a thread that the estate had merely pulled into daylight. By the 1990s, when the first classified documents began to leak and journalists started threading together whispers of the Hartwell estate with the strange consistency of survivor accounts, an even more chilling pattern emerged, one that suggested the Hartwell rituals were not simply about control of individuals, but about bending the flow of entire events. Researchers working independently of government oversight noticed that many survivors spoke in cryptic sequences, stringing words or symbols together that at first seemed like nonsense, but, when charted over time, corresponded eerily with disasters and cultural ruptures that had not yet occurred. A man in Ohio drew a spiral intersected with 3 slashes across a calendar page in 1989. 2 years later, it mirrored the structural collapse of a bridge, the slashes aligning uncannily with the fractured beams shown in photographs. A woman institutionalized in 1992 described fire falling in twin lines from a sky that had forgotten silence, a vision that, in retrospect, bore terrifying resonance with what would happen in New York nearly a decade later. Investigators who mapped these utterances against historical events began to suspect that the rituals at Hartwell were not merely psychological experiments, but channels, frameworks for stitching future into present, sewing disaster into destiny. The quilts, once dismissed as the ramblings of a cursed family, were now understood by some as calendars, as predictive tapestries where threads of color marked not seasons, but catastrophes. Survivors' testimonies, riddled with images of veils tearing, of brides burning, of vows rewritten in ash, became less the rambling of broken minds and more the fractured signals of people who had glimpsed the loom itself, the hidden architecture where power weaves the path of nations, government agencies already implicated in weaponizing the ES. Tate's legacy buried these connections beneath the rhetoric of psychotic delusions. But the few who had gathered enough evidence recognized that the Hartwell estate had never been about one family's curse or even one nation's hunger for control. It had been a nexus, a place where corruption, ritual, and science converged into something capable of reshaping the very fabric of history, one disaster at a time. The question no one could answer was whether the survivors were warning of events, or whether the rituals themselves had caused them, as though the act of stitching had not only recorded fate, but written it. By the late 1990s, intelligence operatives quietly involved in counterterrorism and psychological operations had begun taking the Hartwell patterns seriously, though they would never speak of it publicly. What started as curiosity and academic leaks transformed into a covert strategy. If these survivor accounts and the quilt's coded designs could anticipate or even influence events, then harnessing them could provide unimaginable power. Analysts were instructed to collect every fragment of testimony, every preserved quilt, and every journal, translating them into matrices of probability, timelines, and contingency grids. Meetings were held in secure bunkers where veteran operatives, unaccustomed to speaking of superstition, whispered about the bride's clock and the groom's eye, terms that once belonged to folklore but now functioned as operational code words. Exercises were run where the visual patterns were projected across screens, and officers reported visceral reactions, headaches, nausea, sudden chills, as if the symbols themselves were alive, pulsating with intent. Plans for interventions, military, political, and economic, were overlaid upon these projections, creating scenarios that seemed to manifest in reality with disturbing precision. Whistleblowers later described how analysts began seeing echoes of the original Hartwell brides in their own operations. The ritual's logic, the sequencing of action and silence, the veiled instruction to exploit obedience and fear, all applied not to isolated subjects, but to entire populations. Yet as powerful as these methods appeared, those working closest to them reported a constant dread, a gnawing fear that they were not mastering the system, but merely participants in a ritual older than themselves. Some quietly disappeared, their absences dismissed as retirements or transfers, but colleagues whispered of the same unexplainable marks, scars in geometrical shapes, repeated dreams of veiled women, and the sense that eyes, silver, omniscient, watched through every wall and document. And always, the realization hung heavy. The Hartwell estate had birthed more than a psychological experiment. It had created a template, a machinery that, once activated, could extend its influence across decades, manipulating the minds of those who thought themselves in control while shaping the trajectory of nations in accordance with a covenant whose origin was older than any archive, older than any law, and far darker than any man could comprehend. Even now, in the digital age, the Hartwell legacy refuses to die, seeping through cracks in history and technology alike, its threads invisible yet persistent, weaving influence over minds attuned to secrecy, power, and fear. Encrypted forums, private social media channels, and dark web archives hold fragments of the quilt's patterns, the journal's cryptic notations, and recordings of survivor testimonies, often disguised as art, code, or ritualistic performance, waiting for those who know where to look. Members of secret societies whisper about the bride's sequence in private chambers, tracing shapes on tablets or walls, convinced that the symbols contain keys to power, wealth, or enlightenment. Occasionally, journalists or independent researchers stumble upon these clues, only to disappear, be discredited, or vanish into bureaucratic oblivion, leaving behind accounts dismissed as paranoid fantasies. Analysts who follow the threads report an almost sentient quality to the legacy. Patterns recur across continents, across generations, cropping up in financial algorithms, architectural designs, even in the choreography of political influence, as though the covenant Hartwell established was not just a historical curiosity, but a living framework for manipulation, one that feeds on obedience, silence, and fear. Some claim that the original Hartwell estate, now long abandoned and fenced with cameras, still functions as a conduit, a locus of ritual energy pulsing faintly under the night sky, calling to those sensitive to its designs. And in quiet moments, survivors or their descendants whisper of seeing shapes flash at the edge of vision, veils tearing, brides moving in slow procession, eyes like silver coins watching from the darkness, reminding them that the covenant never sleeps. Those who uncover even a fragment feel the weight immediately. The knowledge carries a curse, not of supernatural origin, but of truth. Once a man sees the framework, once he recognizes the mechanics of obedience and erasure, he cannot unsee it. He becomes both witness and participant, and the covenant begins to inscribe itself upon him as it has inscribed itself upon generations before. The Hartwell legacy is no longer just a story buried in New England soil. It is an active system, a hidden hand shaping minds and history alike, and to engage with it is to risk being stitched into its tapestry, bound forever by threads invisible yet unbreakable. In the early 2020s, a cryptographer named Elias Hawthorne, ironically bearing a name that echoed the Hartwell bloodline, began to notice anomalies in datasets that seemed disconnected at first. Sequences in financial markets, peculiar alignments in historical records, and recurring symbols embedded subtly in corporate logos and government memos. At first he thought it was coincidence, a quirk of pattern recognition, until a fragment of a Hartwell quilt surfaced in a private online auction, stitched with the same symbols he had been cataloging in spreadsheets, its threadwork almost impossibly precise. That night, he dreamt of the brides, veiled and silent, pacing the floor of a darkened hall, and woke to find the symbols etched faintly on his apartment walls, as if someone, or something, had traced them in his sleep. Hawthorne began cross-referencing the symbols with survivor testimonies, old journals, and declassified government files, slowly reconstructing a map of influence that spanned a century, and with each connection, the weight on his mind grew unbearable. He received anonymous messages, emails containing only sequences of numbers and images of quilts, some depicting events that hadn't yet occurred, but that later manifested with chilling precision. The more he decoded, the more he realized the Hartwell covenant was not a story. It was a system, a living algorithm, and anyone who probed it deeply risked being consumed, altered, or erased. Hawthorne found himself shadowed by figures who claimed to be academics, journalists, and private investigators, each probing too close to the truth, vanishing without a trace. Their last communications fragmented and garbled, repeating phrases like, "The groom sees all," or "Obey the weave." Friends he confided in began reporting strange dreams of veils and brides, sudden ailments, or compulsions they could not explain. Hawthorne himself became increasingly isolated, obsessed, and meticulous, drawing complex charts and interweaving timelines with quilt patterns and historical events, aware that each revelation drew the Covenant's attention ever closer. Yet even as he trembled under the invisible weight of the system, he recognized a truth that had eluded generations. The Hartwell legacy was not merely to be observed, recorded, or studied. It demanded engagement, a reckoning that would either break a man or remold him into a vessel for its continuation. And as Hawthorne pieced together the final sequences, he understood with grim clarity that some knowledge is dangerous precisely because it cannot be ignored, because once the mind perceives the threads of power, the world itself becomes a fabric of obedience, and the Covenant begins to write its will directly onto the soul. By the time Hawthorne reached the final sequences, hidden deep within a collection of digitized journals and quilt fragments scattered across the globe, the weight of the Hartwell Covenant pressed upon him with suffocating inevitability. Every symbol, every notation, every whispered phrase in the survivor testimonies coalesced into a single, horrifying framework. The brides, the groom, the rituals, the vanished family, and the government's secret programs were all part of a continuum, a living architecture designed to bend human will across generations, to encode obedience, fear, and memory itself into a lattice that spanned time and geography. Hawthorne realized that understanding it fully meant more than knowledge. It demanded action, a participation that would either dissolve him utterly or elevate him into a conduit for the system itself. He found himself standing before the last remaining quilt, displayed not in a museum but in a private, undisclosed facility, its threads vibrating with a subtle energy, almost imperceptible yet undeniably present. As he traced the final symbols with his fingers, he felt his mind splinter. Memories of strangers, fragments of those who had vanished over the decades, and echoes of the original Hartwell brides surged through him, threatening to erase the boundaries of his identity. A voice, or perhaps a thought implanted by the Covenant itself, whispered the ultimate truth. To fully grasp the Hartwell legacy was to surrender, to become part of the weave, to let the system extend through him as it had through every generation before. Panic rose, yet fascination anchored him. He understood that turning away now would be impossible. The knowledge had lodged itself in his mind, inescapable, irreversibly transformative. And then the choice presented itself, stark and terrible, to step fully into the Covenant, gaining the forbidden clarity to manipulate patterns of history and human behavior at a level no man had ever achieved, or to reject it, to fight the system, knowing that refusal would obliterate him, body and soul, leaving nothing but an echo in the continuum. Hawthorne hesitated, realizing that this was the moment the Hartwell legacy had orchestrated for a century, a moment of ultimate reckoning, where curiosity, fear, and power intersected, and only those willing to surrender entirely could survive in any meaningful sense. In that instant, the estate, the quilts, the journals, the whispers of brides long dead, and the Covenant itself all seemed to converge, and Hawthorne understood with bone-deep clarity that the Hartwell legacy was not just history, it was a living force, patient, relentless, and waiting for the next mind audacious enough to trace its patterns to the end. And so we arrive at the end, though there is no true end, only the awareness that the Hartwell legacy stretches beyond the limits of comprehension, waiting, observing, and shaping those who dare to look too closely. As Hawthorne's mind trembled under the weight of ultimate understanding, the viewers, now you, must recognize a chilling truth. This is not just a story of a family buried in secrecy, of brides vanished and rituals unspoken, of an estate that became a conduit for power and control. It is a mirror reflecting the unseen frameworks that govern obedience, fear, and desire in your own world, in your own choices, in every institution you trust, and every command you follow without question. The Hartwell covenant, in its essence, is a metaphor and a warning. Systems of manipulation, ancient and modern, thrive not in plain sight but in the shadows, through subtle repetition, through silence, through small compromises that chain a mind before the chain is recognized. As Hawthorne stood on the precipice of surrender, the power of the covenant flowing through him like a current he could not resist, it becomes clear that knowledge itself is transformative, dangerous, and binding. And now, having glimpsed the threads, having traced the patterns across time, your own perception is altered. You cannot unsee the mechanisms of control, the hidden rituals shaping thought and behavior, the quiet architects of obedience. To solidify this awareness, I invite you to leave a mark in the comments, a phrase that will bind your recognition to action, not once but twice. Write, "I see the thread," and then, "I see the thread" again, as a symbolic affirmation that you are no longer merely a witness, but a participant in the web of awareness that stretches beyond the Hartwell estate, beyond time, beyond those who think they hold power over history. Understand this. Once a mind has perceived the machinery beneath the surface, it can never return to ignorance, and the choice becomes yours, whether to allow it to shape you passively or to wrest mastery from its hidden architects, becoming aware, vigilant, and unbreakable. The Hartwell brides, the groom, the quilts, the vanished family, and the covenant that endures. They are not confined to New England soil. They are a living testament to the potency of hidden forces, and their lesson is clear. Power is often invisible, obedience is often silent, and the price of awareness is eternal vigilance. You have seen the thread, you have felt the weight, and now, in this revelation, you carry the legacy forward, forever altered, forever awake,